Thank you everyone for joining us. We don't have a ton of people here today, which is maybe kind of nice because then if you have specific questions, hopefully we'll get them answered. But yeah, so my name's Hope. I am the youth program manager for Vines. I started with Vines in 2017 and I've been gardening in some sort of form since then. So I know a little bit, but if I don't know your questions, we have a bunch of other workshops I can point you to and some other people that could answer your questions. But yeah, so I'm gonna get started and share my screen. If you have any questions as we go, feel free to just say them since we have such a small group, or type them in the chat if you feel more comfortable with that. Sarah here is our community garden intern and she will be helping me moderate and answer any questions and keep things smooth. So I'm going to start sharing my screen so I can show you our presentation we have. Okay, slideshow, play from start. Okay, can you see it, everyone?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yes, so welcome to our Gardening 101 workshop. You can be a beginner for this workshop or you can be gardening for years. I feel like we'll all probably hopefully learn something from each other. But yeah, so does everyone, if you could type in the chat or just tell me where you plan to start your garden this year, or if you already have one, if you're gonna maybe in your backyard or at a community garden, if you could just let me know so I could get a little bit of a idea. But if you don't have somewhere to garden, this map shows our community gardens around the area. And we have 19 right now. And I think there's a lot that are still open. There's some that might be already full, but if you're interested, that's all that information's on our website. And you can garden at one of these for a small fee, or we offer scholarships if you don't have an area in your yard or if you don't have a spot for containers on your porch. So we like to let everyone garden, even if you don't have the space. Let's see. Okay, so this is just a little bit of housekeeping. If I know Zoom has become kind of a mainstay recently, but if you're not familiar, I'll just go over this quickly. So if you want to talk, you just have to click join with computer audio. There's a bunch of controls at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to start your video, you can, you don't have to. And then just, if you could, everyone, please just stay on mute unless you have a question. That just keeps down background noise and will help me keep focused because I get distracted easily. And any donations are welcome. These are the workshops are free, but if you'd like to donate, you can. And there's a link on our website for that. If you have any questions, like I said, just go ahead and ask since we're in such a small group, or put them in the chat if you'd rather do it like that. Either way is fine. And there will be a survey at the end. Sarah, will you send that out?
I do have a link to that actually.
Okay. So if you guys could fill that out after this, that would be great. But yeah, so I think we're gonna get started from here. So this is just our outline of what this workshop's gonna look like. In the first half, we're just gonna start right at the beginning, how to get started. We'll also go over a square foot gardening method, which is what method that we really like to push to any beginner, anyone getting started that's like, I don't know where to start. This is a really awesome method because it's straightforward. And then we'll go over some garden maintenance, some tips and tricks that we have that we've learned over the years. And then the second half, while we do a Q&A, I'll give you a little bit of time to draw out your garden grid if you would like to do that while I'm here so I can answer questions. We do have this packet that you may have printed out. If you didn't, that's okay. But it should have gotten emailed to you. It has all the slides on it. And then just so you can take notes or you could just use a pen and paper, or you could just listen. And then there's a bunch of other materials like the seed information chart, and then also a blank grid, which if you're interested at the end, you can use to plan out your garden. But yeah, so that's our little outline. And if I'm ever going too fast or anything, just let me know. Okay, so next thing we're going to consider is where you want to start growing. So there's a bunch of different options. The main thing we like to recommend is a raised bed, either at a community garden or at your house. We do have plans for a raised bed that is on our website, and it's the one that we use at all of our community gardens if you'd like to build it at your own house, or you can rent a community garden. There's also container gardening, where you could just use 5-gallon buckets or grow bags, which are the fabric ones. But we do have a workshop coming up on container gardening. I think that's later in May, if you're interested in doing it that way. Or there is the ground. Like I said, we usually recommend raised beds just because it's pretty difficult to start from scratch, like to till soil up here, especially because it's clay soil usually. And another big thing is that in Binghamton, we do have a lot of lead in our soil. So you definitely, I think it's best to start with a raised bed or containers. But if you're in the ground, just make sure you test your soil is one thing we recommend, to make sure that there's not a ton of lead in it or anything else funky. But one way to test your soil is through the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I think it's like $9. You send a sample of your soil, and then they send you the results back. So that's a really great way to test your soil and see what is in it. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to us. Because I mean, before I worked at Vines, I never tested soil, but it is a really smart thing to do. The other thing to consider if you are wherever you're gardening is the sun. You want to have at least 6 hours of full sun per day. That is really important, but it's something you definitely want to consider because crops like tomatoes and peppers that really love the heat definitely need at least 6 hours of sun a day. So that is one important thing. Another thing to think about, I know it's funny, it seems pretty straightforward, but it's just access to water. I know my old apartment didn't have a hose, so I would have to bring a bucket out or a watering can. So that is one thing to think about, is where you're getting your water from. And then another thing is just pests and disease. That we, like I keep saying, we have another workshop coming up on this. I think it's May 6th or 7th, that will go into depth on pests and disease. But it's just one thing to consider and to think about when you do have your own garden. Some things might eat your plants. And if you live in an area that has a lot of deer, like I live on the south side, we have deer that I think are a different breed. They're just very intense and will eat anything. So that's one thing to think about too, is if you need a fence. So on this next slide, here's just some different examples. On the top left, that's one of our community gardens. And those are the raised, the ones in the middle are what our raised beds usually look like. And those are we have plans, like I said, on our website that tell you exactly how to build one of those and exactly what you need, if you're interested in that. And those are free, of course. And then the top right shows a cute deer that would love to eat your garden, and a really tall deer fence. They do recommend, if you have deer, that your fence should be at least 8 feet tall, which sounds crazy, but they will jump over a shorter fence. So that's just one thing to consider too. And then the bottom is just your regular old 5-gallon bucket, which works really great, especially for tomatoes. If you have a sunny spot on your porch, just throw them in there. And that works really great because then you can move them and all that stuff. So that is one really nice way to do it if you want to start small, which it's always great to start small if you're just beginning. So the next step is, well, the first step is getting started. So thinking about where we are, if you are in Binghamton, we're in what's called the Zone 5B. So if you just Google that, that will show you what does well in our area and when our first and last frost dates are. So that's really important. You don't really want to get anything in the ground until after our last frost date, which is usually around the beginning of May. So that'll be soon, yay. And then the last frost date is usually in October. So that's when things your garden starts to wind down. Another thing too is if you are interested in starting just with seeds, is to get them early. I know right about now, if you don't have seeds, it would be a good time to start doing that. Just because, especially during the pandemic, there've been a lot of shortages, and just because everyone's interested in getting outside right now and gardening, because it's kind of a crazy time, and that's something stable and nice to focus on, and you know where your food's coming from then. So that is one recommendation we have, is getting your seeds early. Another thing, which sounds funny, but plant what you want to eat. I know I've done this a lot. I get really excited when I see all the starts and seeds, and I'm like, I'm gonna get all of this, and then I eat not a lot of it, or it's just way too much for my area, my garden space, I mean. So that's one big thing to think about, is just starting small. If it's your first year gardening or your first couple of years gardening, I just really recommend starting out with a few plants and things that you really love. I know not everyone loves tomatoes, but there's nothing like a garden tomato right out of your garden. So that is one nice way to start. But yeah, so just think about what you're growing, I guess. And then the last thing is thinking about fertility and compost. So you don't have to have a backyard compost system, even though it is really nice and easy to do. We have another workshop on that coming up. But you do want to think about your fertility, because each year that you plant a garden in the same place, the plants are taking fertility out of the soil. So just adding compost each year, you can get that from garden centers. You can add leaf mulch, you can add anything like that, that will just help your fertility. And that way you don't have to add pesticides or anything like that, because you'll be getting the fertility from a natural source. So definitely thinking about compost is a really great thing to do. Does anyone have any questions so far? Everyone doing all right? Just want to make sure.
I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, nice to see you, Selena. I'm in New York City now.
Oh, hey.
And I am building garden beds this year in my community garden plot.
Okay.
And it's really hard for me to find compost. My community garden provides compost, but the talk of the town is it's like you have to sift through it because it's really kind of not that clean and has like big pieces of garbage or like things you really don't want to put in your soil. So do you have any like just general recommendations as to where maybe like leaf mulch can be found or things like that?
Yeah, that's hard with the city. I know that around here, like our local municipalities have, like, say the town of Endicott has like a place where you can go to get compost. So I'm not sure how that works in the city. I'm guessing you don't have any like garden center. Do you have any like garden centers or anything like that? Like kind of ag waste sort of things?
Not really. I heard there's a place I can pick up manure. Someone at my garden told me that.
Yeah, I think that is great. As long as it's composted and old manure, adding that is awesome. Just like a top layer on top, and incorporating that in. But top dressing is totally fine if you just add like a layer on top. But if you can get access to that, that would be great.
Oh, thank you. And compost is supposed to be your topmost layer, or is it mixed in with like your vermiculite and like other like peat moss? Because that's what I bought too.
Yeah, so when you're first getting started, it's good to mix in, but if you already have the bed established, just throwing it on the top layer is totally fine.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so the next place we're going to go is talking about the square foot gardening method, which, like I mentioned, is something that we really like to push to folks that are just beginning, because it really, if you can see in these pictures, it's literally just putting a grid on your bed square foot. So if you just measure and at each 1 foot mark, just putting a piece of twine, however you want to attach it, a staple gun works, a tack, whatever works. But it's literally just making a square foot grid on your bed. And then we have guides in this packet and in the other, in what was emailed to you about how many plants and what plants can go in each square. So that is a really good way to do it. It just simplifies things. It definitely maximizes production too, because I know I did this my first year gardening. I get a ton of tomato plants, and then by the end, they're just a big weave together mess because they vine, and I never thought about that. And so this tells you exactly what should go where and what should go, and how the spacing should be. So it's definitely a great way to go. And it does cut down on weeds, because how the plants are spaced, it makes it so it shades out the weeds. So in the height of the summer, you really won't have to be doing a lot of weeding. And you'll mostly just have production, hopefully, of food to eat. So like I just mentioned, this is just a grid out of your garden bed. It really takes the guesswork out, I think. And things definitely get bigger than you think they will. So this is a great way to look at things before you plant your bed, and to determine how big plants do get. So this has a lot of information on it. We do have all this information in your packet. But yeah, so like I said, it just makes it so you don't have to guess, which I think is really nice, especially when it's like, you get a tomato plant at the store and it's this big, and then by the end of the summer, it's a couple feet tall and super wide and bushy and crazy. So this just helps you think about that before the end of the summer. So this is just an example of what I was saying. A mature tomato is much larger than a tomato plant start. Another thing to think about too is the garden orientation. So you get the most sun from the south. So the biggest thing, I think, is planting the smallest plants that you have, like lettuces and stuff like that, that doesn't get really big, on the south side, and then the tall plants on the north side. So that way the tall plants will not shade out the smaller plants, if that makes sense. And another note too is if you're trellising any plants, say you have like snap peas or green beans, anything that needs a trellis, the best is to put it on the north side, because those usually get tall, really bushy and crazy. So any herbs, anything like that, short plants put on the south side. And then the tall, bigger plants, kale, tomatoes, anything like that, put on the north side. So that's just one thing to think about. Here is a planning chart. There is one in your packet. And if you're new to gardening, it is a really nice way to start to think about what you want to plant and what that means. Just sketching it out is really smart, and planning, I think, is kind of key when you're just starting out, because you're not sure how it's going to turn out. And once you've had a garden after a few years, you get used to it, and maybe you don't want to or need to plan out the chart. But I think that in the beginning, it's definitely great to do something like this, just because you know when you have to put it in the ground, how long it's going to take, how wide it gets, where you should put it in your bed, if you should start it from seed or if you should start it from a transplant, which are the baby plants. So I think that's a great way to do it. And things to think about, I think, too, are just like what will give you the best value. Think about what's super cheap at the grocery store that you're fine with buying there, or what's kind of expensive at the store that you would rather grow yourself. Because seeds, as you know, like you can get a pack of hundreds of seeds for a couple dollars. There's a lot more work than just getting it from the store, but it's definitely a lot cheaper in certain cases. And the other thing too to think about in your first years is what's easy, honestly. Things like peas are really easy, green beans, stuff like that, lettuces, things that just grow like crazy and you don't have to think about really hard. Tomatoes are always nice to start out. So just really thinking about things that are straight to the point, don't have a lot of crazy things that go with them, are a good way to start. And like I mentioned before, think about what you like to eat a lot. I know it's like simple, but it's definitely something to think about. And it would be something that makes you excited to see grow too, which I think is really important. But yeah, so just think about ease, value. This next chart is a seed information chart, which I think is really, really helpful. This is for our zone. So you could follow this to a T and just use all these things or use all these veggies and plant those. And all the information is right there. So just start looking at what it takes to grow certain crops. And when you're thinking about your seeds too, say you have seeds from last year, make sure you check the expiration date because they do expire. And sometimes if they're old, they won't germinate well, which is always sad because they just don't come up and then you got to start over again. And looking at how much space they need, how much sun they need, how long they take. It's all things to think about. It feels like a lot, I'm sure sometimes, but all the information is right here. And of course, we're always here for questions. And so where it says hardiness too, it doesn't show it on this slide, but on the sheet in your packet, it tells what those letters mean. I think let me see if I can find it. Yeah, so it just said like VT is very tender, so it'll be, it could get damaged easily in cold temperatures, and then VH is very hardy, so it will last through the winter, things like kale. So there's that's how to read that chart. And this next page is just looking at a seed packet. Like I said, one big thing to check is how old the seed packet is, if you've had it for a long time. Sorry, never mind. So just make sure you check out how deep if you're putting them right in your bed or in your garden, check out how deep the seed should go, how tall it'll get, how long it'll take to get there, and how much sun it needs, all the general things I've been mentioning. So that can all be found under seed packet. And next we're going to talk about mapping it out. Does anyone have any questions right now? I know this is a lot of information.
There was a question in the chat earlier. Mm-hmm. Can you give a Broome County place where we can buy compost and what kind?
Yes. So we get our compost from the Robinson Hill soil that's up in Johnson City. That they offer a blended soil, which is really nice. You can also get compost from Agway. I know they have it in like bulk, but you can also go to places like Lowe's. They'll sell like bags of composted manure, because those are nice if you just need a small amount, you want it in a bag, it's easier to transport instead of getting it loose, like at places like Agway or Robinson Hill soil, like I mentioned. Yeah, so any place like that, I recommend. We also use, if you have, say, you know, someone that has like a horse farm, a lot of times they have a lot of manure that has been sitting for a long time. So I think if it has to be at least 6 months. I'm not totally sure on that, but just make sure it's actually composted. You don't want to be putting fresh horse manure on your garden, but as long as it's been sitting for a long time, that's always a really nice amendment. Yeah, so just mapping it out, things you want to think about if you do go with the square foot gardening method, is just to look at the planting chart that we have in this packet, what plants and when to plant them, how many plants go per square. So things like tomatoes need 4 square feet for 1 plant, but then things like kale, you could put 1 plant in 1 square foot. And all of that, like I keep saying, is in the packet. And planting in the garden bed, I think, is also a good way to do it. Actually putting the square feet garden on the bed. So you actually have the twine out and you can think about this will go in this square, this will go in this square, this will need 4 squares, things like that.
I have a question about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if you for instance said like 1 kale per square foot, or like earlier it said 1 cabbage. So what does that mean in terms of like then production later? Because you're not, it would produce more than 1. I can't ask this correctly, but do you understand what I'm saying? Like
Yeah,
how much would you produce if you're only planting 1 plant?
Yeah, so if you plant it, say you plant 1 tomato plant, you'll get a lot of tomatoes. If you plant kale, you can harvest from that plant all season long usually. So a lot of things, like say you put 1 plant, will come back and will continue to produce. Like peppers, you'll get a couple peppers per 1 plant. Does that help?
Yeah. So
Okay.
what if in 1 square foot I did want to put like 2 plants of kale? Do you think that would be like too much?
I think just with spacing, it would be best to put 1 plant in each square just because they get kind of bushy. But yeah, so
okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so there's that.
There's another question in the chat. They said, last year I put in manure and I think I used too much. Will the composted manure be better? Should I limit how much I put in, or can I put in lots?
As long as it's composted, my recommendation is if you already have a bed established, just we call it top dressing. So if you just put a nice layer on top, that will be good. But if you think you put in enough last year, it would probably be fine this year. Did your bed produce well?
Last year when I put the manure in, the plants were healthy. Like I had store-bought plants that I put in the ground. I didn't really know what I was doing.
Oh, that's a good move.
Kind of put manure around them. But they were fine until I did the manure, and then the leaves all started turning yellow.
So that's an excess of, I want to say nitrogen, but I'm not totally sure. So it could be that, what kind of manure was it?
I don't know.
That's okay. That's totally fine. Yeah, so I think that maybe it was too much for the plants. So maybe this year incorporating it actually into the soil would be better than putting it directly around the plants. But I do think that the yellowing of the leaves is in excess of, I want to say nitrogen, but I'm not totally sure, which would make sense with manure. Cool.
All right. And there's one more question from Facebook. Sure. Is it possible to make the tomato grow vertically rather than expanding and taking up the area?
Yes, that can be done with pruning, which you can find how to do online. It's pretty straightforward once you get the hang of it. And trellising your tomatoes are the biggest things. Okay, so right now we're going to talk about transplants versus seeding. As a beginning gardener, I always recommend buying plants from places like Agway. Agway usually has way less disease problems than places like Lowe's and Home Depot, but you can get things from Lowe's and Home Depot, but I more recommend somewhere local like Agway, like Nanaco Gardens, places like that. Sometimes they're a little expensive, but you can use your SNAP benefits to buy seeds and transplants because they're food. So the other thing to think about, I really don't recommend starting your own seeds unless you have like a crazy greenhouse setup or grow lights and the space to do it. I tried to start seeds a couple years ago and I had one grow light and it just didn't work out. I didn't have a lot of success. So the biggest thing that I've learned that really is helpful is to just buy the plants already started. Vines does have a limited amount of starts, usually around in May, if you're interested in that and can't get your own. So just let us know about that. But like I said, I just really recommend going that way. It'll really set you up for success. And you won't be disappointed, which I was a couple years ago. I'm like, oh, I'm going to start my seeds. It'll be great. And it was just not so great because I didn't have the right setup. But if you do have the right setup and you're experienced, go for it.
What about starting your seeds like right from your garden bed in the soil?
Yes, so there are certain seeds actually on this next slide that are really good for just direct seeding. So you can buy seeds that like to go right in the soil, like things like root crops really like to go directly in the soil because they have such a long taproot. They don't like to be disturbed. Like, so if you transplant them, you don't want to mess with them and then put them in your soil. So things like beets, turnips, carrots, all of that stuff, beans, peas do really well direct seeded. Lettuces do really well direct seeded, spinach. So things like that. This chart is really nice because it has all the kind of like general things.
Yeah, this is a super helpful chart actually.
But yeah, so I know, because that's the biggest thing too. I remember when I first started is like what does well just being planted as a seed. So, and then things like tomatoes, peppers, things that are long season crops that take a long time, you want to buy already started because they have been started weeks ago and they'll be ready to go in the ground in May, and will do great. But once you get your garden started, you can definitely direct seed things that grow pretty quickly. This bottom chart, direct seed or transplant, things in the cabbage family, I would probably recommend getting transplants of, just because I've found that they do better that way. But herbs are great for starting directly in the soil. Like I said, a bunch of lettuces are really good for direct seeding also. But this is a great chart if you have any questions about that. But like I said, you can't go wrong with buying transplants. Those are always really great. Okay, so this is just kind of like a step-by-step for gardening. I mean, starting your garden with square foot gardening. First thing, mark off your squares in your garden if you are going that way. That is the best way to just visualize it, I think, because then you don't have to be like, wait, what's going here, what's going here. If you have a chart that you draw out and then you have it actually laid out on the garden bed, it works out great that way. There's a square foot gardening guide that tells you how many plants per square. And that is, let me see, where is that? It is in here. Yeah, so this one is like a sample. And this shows you what plants do best in certain amount of spaces. So this chart is really nice. You could even copy this chart exactly. Okay. And then determining what plants are going to be direct seeded. When you do direct seed, the best way to do it is to just make a trough kind of, and sprinkle a bunch in that trough, and you'll see them come up in a few days, a few weeks, or a few days usually. And the best thing to do is to plant a lot, but then thin them later. So you can pull some of those tiny plants out so they grow, you have more space and they'll grow better. But that's a good way to guarantee that you will get some plants started. Make sure you label plants. This is another mistake I made. I'm like, what is this? So just like popsicle sticks work really well. Make sure you write it in pen, because you'll be able to see it better. But I do highly recommend labeling things. Water your plants directly after you transplant them, or seeding. The biggest thing when watering plants is to make sure you water from the base of the plant, because you don't, if you get the leaves really wet, they're way more susceptible to disease, and it also can burn the leaves when it's a really sunny, hot day. So definitely try to water from the base of the plant, and water it pretty deeply. It's better to do it deeply and not as often than kind of shallow and more often. So just make sure you give them a good drink, especially right after you transplant things. Here's some trellising methods. Things like cucumbers, tomatoes, peas, beans really like to be excuse me, need to be trellised. So on the left is a way, I forget what it's called, but that's where you just kind of string the twine back and forth, and the plant will grow in there. And sometimes you just have to tuck them in, and but that's a nice, easy, straightforward way to do it. People get really creative with different trellising methods. The top right shows like someone weaved some sticks together, which is cool if you have time and energy to do that. And then the bottom right is just some old like garden, what, I always forget the name of this, like hard wire fabric. It's just the mesh, and that stuff is really nice for gardens. You can kind of put it on a slant and support it with sticks or whatever you have. With tomatoes, a lot of times, just in my garden, I'll just put a stake next to them and then tie them to the stake, and that works just fine. There's also tomato cages. Go ahead.
Trellising is like what you do with tomatoes, basically like the stake, because I didn't know the term for it, but I know that like tomatoes grow vertically up, and like that's what you're trying to do. So cucumbers require the same thing.
Yes. Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. What was I? Oh yeah. So the biggest thing I recommend, say with a tomato plant, is to make sure you trellis it early, or if you're putting a tomato cage on it, make sure you do that early, because it'll be very difficult once the plant is humongous, and it'll be super hard to get a tomato cage over that. So make sure if you are using tomato cages, just to put them on early. Yeah, okay, that's trellising. Fencing, like I said, if you have deer, you'll definitely need a fence. It stinks, but it's life. It's the fact of the matter. Deer will eat your garden. But there's many options. The top right is a more elaborate way. That would be if you definitely have deer. And the biggest thing too, I think, is just knowing what pest you're dealing with, watching your yard or watching your front porch and seeing what comes around, what seems to be extra hungry. Squirrels are a big pest too, which sometimes you can put like mesh over the top of the garden bed. That's kind of sometimes the only way you can do it. Like we said, go high for deer. They can jump pretty high. If you have woodchucks, they do like to dig. So one thing I've seen people do is burying chicken wire. Instead of burying, like say it would be on the edge of your fence, instead of burying it like this, you bend it like this. If you guys can see me, it kind of at like a 90-degree angle. So if this is your fence and this is your chicken wire, they'll be digging in this way and they'll hit it, and they won't be able to get under your garden, under your fence. So that's a good thing for woodchucks. And then if you do have a raised bed, that plastic green fencing is pretty nice. That, because you could just staple it to the outside of your garden bed. It keeps out things like cats, which are in the city. If you see a lot of cats around, they like to use raised beds as their personal litter boxes. So that's one thing to think about. Rabbits, that'll keep rabbits out, and woodchucks, usually because your raised bed is already up, so they can't dig under the side. So that green plastic is really nice if you have a raised bed. Okay. So other tips, like I said, thinning your crops is a really good way to do it. That's when, like I mentioned earlier, when you plant a bunch of seeds, if you're direct seeding them, and this is a really good thing to do with like carrots or beets, because then you will pull out plants so it's the right spacing. I think it's like a couple inches apart, and that way they'll have more room to grow a big fruit. So if you have beets all together, they'll be tiny little guys, but if you kind of separate them, you'll get bigger beets. So that's just one thing to think. Succession planting is when you think about, say, I put in peas right at the beginning of the season, they'll be done by midsummer. So one thing to think about is you could pull those plants out once they're all done in the summer, and then put another short season crop in their space. So say I do peas in the beginning and then green beans later in the summer, because those are both short season crops, and they mature really quickly and fruit really quickly. So that is one thing to think about and will maximize your space. But if you're just beginning and you want to keep it simple, keep it simple. Like I mentioned too, water at the base of the plants regularly. That's much better to prevent disease and to just keep your plants healthy. Planting marigolds is a great tip. Say at the end of your bed, it makes it pretty, and then also pests hate the smell of them. So marigolds are great. And another thing too is planting flowers around your bed because it attracts pollinators. You want the good pollinators to come and pollinate all your crops. So flowers are always nice. And apparently flea beetles, which we have a lot of in the city of Binghamton, radishes do not like that, or they do not like radishes. So that's one thing to think about. Hopefully, I mean, flea beetles may not like them, but if you don't like them either, don't plant them. But yeah, so that's just a few things to think about, some general tips that I think are kind of embrace a lot of the issues that happen with gardening in the beginning. Okay, so now it's time to think about planning your garden. You don't necessarily have to have everything printed out, but I did make an example of what my theoretical garden would look like. We still have to, I just moved into a new house, so we still have to build some garden beds. Hopefully we do that before the season starts. But I plan to make some 4x10 beds, just like we do at Vines, because I've built many of them. But this is like the chart that you have in your packet. As you can see here, this is the north side, so I put my tomatoes up here, my kale, and all the tall things, peppers. So the tomatoes take up 4 square feet. So that's why these are so big. And then things like kale and stuff only take up 1 square foot. My bed, I'm planning to be, it's going to be 4x10. So you just draw out with a straight edge, or if you have really straight lines, that works too. If they're a little wiggly, that's okay. And then towards the bottom, I have things that are shorter, like lettuce, beets, carrots, a bunch of root crops, things like that. And then I put down here, just so I know which way's the south. Our neighbor has some pear trees over here, so I can think about what side this is and the orientation of it. But yeah, so that's just my example. We'll do a little Q&A here in a little bit, and you guys can work on drawing this if you want. You don't have to, but all the information that you need for that is in your packet. So a few notes I wrote down for when you are drawing your garden bed is one way you can do it is make a chart for each section of the season. This is maybe if you are a little more experienced. Say you can make like a spring photo or spring chart, sorry. And that can be for like, say I want to start out with spinach here, but that will be done because it's a short season crop by summer. So then I can have another chart for summer, and a lot of this will stay the same, but since spinach is a short season crop and it'll be done, I can have something for its replacement. So that's just one thing to think about. That's called succession planting, if you're interested in that. But yeah, so here's that chart. This is in the packet. And the chart on the left would be what you would use to draw out your grid. Say it could be a 2x3 plot, whatever you have or whatever you plan to do. And then that chart on the right is really helpful and tells you how many plants can go in each square, depending on the plant. So like I said, you could even like copy this almost directly. If you want to start out super simple and straightforward, that's always a good way to go. But yeah, so that's what I have. Right now, I'll definitely open for some questions if anyone has any thoughts or any tips, whatever they've learned last year, anything like that. If anyone has anything to say or add, please feel free.
Do you guys have anything on succession planting, like a chart or a what to keep in mind plan or
I don't think so. That would be something. So one place we get a lot of our information is from an organization called the Food Project, and they are out of Boston, Massachusetts, and they have some really amazing resources online. So I would recommend checking them out. And then also Cornell Cooperative Extension has a lot of really good stuff on things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so we don't have anything directly, but there definitely is some good stuff out there. Cool. It hurts to thin plants. It does hurt to thin plants. I know that feeling because you're like, oh no, but they do produce much better once you do that. But how does everyone feel? Did anyone have a garden last year that anything went wrong or you learned anything? I know that's one of the biggest things with gardening is just thinking about what went wrong and what went right last year, and going from there.
Yeah, someone on Facebook actually asked, can you share what mistakes you did when you first started with seeds and what failed, what went wrong there? So
yeah. So the first thing so seeds need a lot of warmth and really nice light. And I don't think I had the right grow light and enough grow lights. So that's a big thing. Also, a lot of seeds need heat to germinate, and I didn't have a heat mat. So that's another thing that is really helpful. There is definitely ways to start your own seeds at home. I'm not saying it's impossible, but you do need a lot of extra things, I think is the biggest thing to think about. And then also, I just didn't know when to start what seeds. So that was where I went wrong mostly. And ever since then, I have been buying transplants and direct seeding anything that is easy to direct seed. Good question though. It's nice too because we can learn from each other's mistakes. But awesome. Is there anything else, Sarah?
that's all from Facebook.
Okay,
and
great.
in the chat. So
Awesome. Thank you. And then you said you'll send out the survey, or Christina sends out the survey?
yeah, it'll be in an email
Okay.
either today or tomorrow.
Okay. And if anyone has any questions that they think of later, feel free to email us or Facebook message us, anything like that. You can find all of our info on our website, vinesgardens.org, and then on our Facebook page, which I'm sure you had to sign up for this workshop, so you know how to get to our website. Because I know sometimes you'll think of questions later after everything happens.
Hope, thank you so much. You're amazing.
You're welcome. It's nice to hear from you, Alina.
I love keeping up with you guys, and I miss you so dearly all the time. I hope
We
everything
miss
is
you.
going well over there.
Thank you. Good luck with gardening in the city. Let me know if you need any other
Thank you.
help.
This
You're
is the first
welcome.
year I'm here for like planting season because my dad's been taking care of it every year because I was in Binghamton. And every year I had to come back to a tomato jungle, various scattered plants. He just like threw seeds everywhere and was like,
Yep.
all right, whatever happens, happens. And I was like, like this year we're doing a reconstruction. We're building beds. Like I learned from vines. That's it.
I love that. Good. Well, it'll be a great year. And that one last note, that is one thing I learned too, is I always bought way more tomato plants than I needed, because then you just have tomatoes coming out of everywhere, which you can freeze or give to your neighbors. But that is one thing to think about.
Exactly. Like unless I'm canning and freezing, I really have to minimize the
Canning.
tomatoes. Yeah.
Yep. And we do have canning workshops and stuff like that in the fall, which is always interesting. But anyways, thank you so much, everyone. This was great, and I definitely learned a lot from you, and I hope you learned some stuff from me. But like I said, any other questions, feel free to contact us and look out for that survey. But thank you very much. Happy gardening, and I hope you have a great Saturday.
Have
Thanks,
a great
Sarah.
Saturday. Thanks.
Yep,
Bye, Hope.
bye.
We just had another question on Facebook.
Yeah, okay.
Popped up. Is a grow light really important if you want to keep the seedling in the window facing the sun?
Yes, because if you don't use a grow light, you need to have the grow light really close to the plants, especially when they're tiny, because otherwise if you just have the sun, they get what we call leggy. So they get really long and are trying to reach for the sun, and they aren't as stable and strong if you don't have a light really close to them.
All right. And I think
Awesome.
that's it from Facebook.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. You've been really helpful.
Yeah, no problem.
Have a great day.
You too.